Okay, welcome everyone. We're still waiting on a few others to join, but thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine Greenberg, and I serve as the Vice President at the San Diego World Affairs Council. Today, we have the opportunity to discuss When Money Moves, Localization and the Future of Humanitarian Aid, with a focus on Ukraine, featuring a panel of experts and hosted by Hector Vivero, who I had the great luck of getting to know as a student at the University of San Diego. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. We ask that all attendees go ahead and mute their microphones. All panel speaker bios are listed on our event page. At the end of the presentation, there will be time for Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat box and note which speaker you would like a response from. This program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for later viewing as well. Without further ado, let's welcome our host, Professor Hector Vivero.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am a professor at the University of San Diego, where I teach the class Principles of Humanitarian Action, and that's where I had the privilege of meeting Catherine. First of all, it is an honor to be sharing here the stage with such a distinguished audience. And when Catherine and we started discussing the possibility of me joining here to give a presentation to you about the topic of localization. This localization topic is a topic that is highly discussed, but it's also very elusive. I started doing my research and I thought okay, so what is a better way for me to actually present the topic of localization to you? And I decided that instead of having someone living in the United States presenting to people living in the United States about things that are happening on the other side of the world, what a better way is for me to actually invite those that are at the forefront of the localization efforts. As a result of that, I started reaching out to many of my colleagues with whom I worked during the past, including my time when I was working in Ukraine prior and during the Russian invasion, and I asked them to join me. Now, why Ukraine? Why did we choose Ukraine? Ukraine, as you know, is the largest or biggest actually funded humanitarian response since Afghanistan. Also, another element about Ukraine is the fact that Ukraine right now is at the forefront of the localization efforts. That's why we decided to have that as our case story and spotlight the Ukraine as our example in this discussion. Now, as I mentioned, the topic of localization is highly discussed but widely elusive. And one of the reasons why that is the case is that the topic of localization can be seen from broad different perspectives. It can be seen from the point of view, seen and analyzed from the systemic perspective, for example, looking from the point of view of large organizations such as UNHCR and other UN agencies. That's why I decided to invite Bryant, who, as a former UNHCR officer and an expert on localization, he will be bringing that perspective and analysis of the systemic point of view. Then I decided to bring a perspective much more of how the localization agenda is actually playing out at the field level. And for that, I invited Olga Ivanova from Support and Stabilization Services. Olga and we actually worked together. We started working together in Ukraine before the 2022, February 2022, when the Russians increased the hostilities in Ukraine. I also decided to extend an invitation to Craig, Craig as a head of mission of Camino. He will give us a very interesting perspective from the point of view of a successful localization example and how localization can be used as an exit strategy for major organizations. But then there's also so many challenges that are both bureaucratic as well as funding from the funding point of view and the perspective. And for that, we need enablers. And for those enablers, Anna, who works for philanthropy in Ukraine, they are at the forefront in Ukraine of removing those many administrative and bureaucratic barriers, as well as advocating with the government and donors at the ground level for the different actors that are present in the localization agenda to make it much more inclusive. And then We also have to be aware that funding, there are many ways for funding localization efforts. And David, through WeAid, they are at the forefront of actually enabling citizen-led initiatives to take on the response. And one of the things that was very interesting that I think is lost during the discussions of localization and when we read in the news and when we read the analysis is the fact that localization is not only a process that is driven from the United States from the point of view of donors, but there are many actors within this ecosystem that includes UN agencies, that include local NGOs, that include international NGOs, that include also citizen-led initiatives, which WeAid was instrumental in actually enabling them to respond. This ecosystem, an eclectic ecosystem, I would call it, was what enabled at the beginning of the invasion for Ukraine to mount one of the most efficient responses that, in my personal experience, I have ever witnessed, and I've worked in several countries, several emergencies across the world, including Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Myanmar, and later on Ukraine. So with that, I leave the floor to Brian for him to start his analysis on the systemic element. Brian.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hector, for for putting this discussion into perspective. And I'll be starting on unpacking localization. Granted, what I'm about to touch on is by all means non-exhaustive. Due to the time constraints, I'm going to focus on three principal points addressing what is localization, why it matters, and how the grand bargain tried to advance it. Secondly, I'll highlight some key system level challenges that have really affected the full rollout and implementation of localization at a system level, not necessarily a country or a mission level. And then I'll present a successful case study that to me offers optimism on the possibilities of bolstering localization, again, at that system level. So on the first point, what is localization and why does it matter? Essentially, localization is a commitment to shift resources and decision-making power as directly as possible to local and national actors in humanitarian response. It's pretty straightforward. And why does it matter? Well, local actors generally are the first responders, they're on the front line, and often they are actually part of the affected community. They bring contextual knowledge, expertise, trust in terms of engagement with local communities. They can bring cost savings and provide long-term sustainability. Now, how does this relate to the grand bargain? The grand bargain was the first system-wide commitment to mainstream localization via humanitarian financing. It was principally requesting or targeting institutional donors and large UN agencies and key NGOs. It's purely voluntary. It was initiated in 2016, and it's composed of 10 commitments that focus on improving the effectiveness and efficiency of humanitarian financing. One of those commitments is on localization. And a key point on localization is increasing direct funding directly to these local actors. It did go through an evolution. The first version was very vague while being ambitious. It aimed for 25% direct targeting. It went eventually to a second iteration, but fundamentally it remained voluntary and it avoided the bigger issues. That is, not tackling the systems changes that keep power and resources concentrated. So this leads me to my second point. What are the system level challenges? Again, I'm only going to focus on a few. There are many. But first and foremost, I think that some key challenges are the brand identity and business models of institutional donors, UN agencies, and NGOs. These identities and business models essentially reinforce their central role and limit the space for local actors. So let me expand on that. What does that mean in terms of donors? Donors identify themselves as stewards of taxpayer funds, and they're focused on accountability. That means that they are policy-driven, they're non-operational, and they really have a limited staff that can engage with partners and manage projects directly. This leads me into the identity of UN agencies and INGOs, and I'm putting them together on purpose here. They're generally considered trusted intermediaries who guarantee delivery, visibility, and compliance. And their business model based on that identity is that they have large global operations composed of HQs, regional offices, and field staff designed to manage at scale and work in complex and high-risk environments. So this goes then, based on the identity in the model, it goes into the development of their funding justification and their strategies. Essentially, the core selling point for fundraising is life-saving delivery. It's visible, it's measurable, and it resonates with taxpayers. Localization, by contrast, is harder to explain. It's longer term and generally presented as an add-on, something that's secondary. Now, what are the implications then? Donors lack staff to engage and manage direct partnerships. This reinforces the reliance and centrality of UN agencies and INGOs. Funding generally flows towards short-term, high-value, life-saving projects, not longer-term localization. And localization would require UN agencies and INGOs to take a step back. But their business model depends on staying central to operations in order to remain competitive. So these points explain why the voluntary commitments in the grand bargain really weren't enough, because it didn't tackle these systematic issues. That said, in the last few minutes, I'd like to showcase a successful example. It's PEPFAR. It's the US President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Essentially, USAID is managing this. It's the donor, but it's also managing. And it contrasts considerably with the grand bargain, which had a target of 25% direct local funding, and it only achieved 3.4% on average. And that actually dropped to less than 2% in the last few years. So remember that, 3.4 to 2% direct funding. PEPFAR, in contrast, set a target of 70% funding to local partners in 2018. And by 2022, it already reached 55% globally. That was nearly $800 million in 1 year that went directly to local partners. Now, why did this happen? Because early on in PEPFAR's existence, most funds were going to US contractors and INGOs. And this was highly criticized as being costly and unsustainable for taxpayers, especially considering that HIV treatment is a lifelong engagement. So how did PEPFAR make it work? Well, it was mandated and had accountability. It was a bipartisan initiative from the government, and it reported directly to Congress. So it had accountability in terms of political consequences if it failed. It also had clear targets and capacity building. So with a 70% goal, the programs ensured that their local partners could absorb that funding. And how that was achieved in one way was also looking at internal operational capacity. USAID restructured itself with program managers, project managers, so they could directly manage contracts, engage stakeholders, and build the local capacity. There was also decision-making and risk adjustments. So decision-making was moved at an operational level to individual country platforms, and the strategies for countries were co-created with governments and local actors. And risk tolerance from the donor's perspective was increased. They understood that this transition was going to have a lot of hiccups. There might have been some initial inefficiencies, but they increased that risk threshold. Now, these were adjustments that really made PEPFAR successful in terms of localization. There are two caveats, though, that I want to highlight before closing out. PEPFAR did keep the overall control of the strategy, And using this approach would be more challenging in a multi-sectoral humanitarian setting because PEPFAR was dedicated to the health sector and very vertical in that sense. But still, what I think is important and what resonates with me is that there was success because PEPFAR and USAID, as the principal donor and I guess the key entity, was willing to change and challenge its identity. They redefined themselves as being a steward that generally outsourced projects to actually having operational capacity and directly engage with locals. Further, change the strategy instead of as saving delivery. That they did that to taxpayer value, sustainability, and strengthening. They made local conclusion. I'm optimistic. I know and it can succeed if it's led principally by donors who redefine their role and adjust their business model. And in terms of humanitarian actors, that will necessitate that they reflect on their identity and move from being trusted intermediaries towards models that put local actors at center. And they'll also have to adjust their funding strategy, broadening how they define value delivery from primarily immediate life-saving assistance to include localization. So we have, in my view, a lot more potential to realize if donors and these intermediary agencies and INGOs adjust and challenge their narrative and their identity, business identity and strategy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, that's really interesting what you highlighted, that element of like the business model of donors in the sense of how the localization agenda basically challenges one of their core business model and identity. The second element that I found interesting from what you mentioned is that definitely there is a commitment. When there is a commitment, there is the political will to do it, it can actually be achieved. So now the question is, given those two elements, how does the localization agenda actually look like when it is being implemented in Ukraine? So for that, I leave the floor to Olga. Olga, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'm very grateful that you decided to spotlight Ukraine because now we have so many things happening in the world and we're definitely losing attention to this particular crisis. To begin with, I'm a director on advocacy and development projects at Ukrainian Charitable Foundation Stabilization Support Services, not very Ukrainian name. And actually, we are example of certain localization ourselves because we started as a working group in Ukraine under Canadian humanitarian actor and later Canadian development actor. But this working group of people affected by the war, and I was one of them, it was so determined to continue the work started by Canadians and to learn from international practices that we founded a local NGO in a format of charity foundation. And yes, right now we have a portfolio consisting of both development projects and humanitarian response projects. I'd rather not to have humanitarian response because it was response on a particularly deep crisis, you know, and it literally hurts when you build some recovery process and capacity building and you do with all the things which should support your my country in development work, and then you have to start from scratch once again with humanitarian response as it started in 2022. Our work was built on local practices and local legislation on request from local communities, and our first big project was a network of advisors on displaced issues, and we had them around all the country, but at that time the donors were not much interested to fund it. It probably was 2019 when was the last year of this project, because like we were not able to persuade that it's something what is needed. We didn't probably know how to do it better, and later we had to talk to those people who were our advisors when the full-scale invasion started, because after several years working with us, with salary, without salary, with different gaps in funding, with different donors, those people, they gained an expertise to be first responders in sense of humanitarian response when Russia attacked the whole country of Ukraine in February of 22. We didn't coordinate them, we didn't pay them, but they were on their places locally, and they were responding together with the government, together with volunteers, with people donating on this. And I think that it was definitely showcase how local networks could work. Our next big project was a network of councils of internally displaced persons to give them representation at local decision making. And I have believed that those councils, they also could be an example of localization and empowerment of people affected by the war, because everyone says we need to consult with those, but it's not often you have a system of such consultation, and you not often have such a network of almost 1,000 councils like this to consult in different moments of decision making, strategy making, and so on and so on. Of course, USAID cuts hurt us. We had to fire almost 70 people in one day. It felt like, I don't know, you lose a relative or something like this. It's like, it feels like funeral, because you have to destroy something what you built so many times, and it's not because of your fault, not because you failed. Other organizations were hurt even more. They had to stop operations, life-saving operations related to HIV response, to support the LGBT communities, to many essential reforms, infrastructure, and prevention of gender-based violence. And it is still like, I don't think we know the whole scope of this damage which was made, because it was an earthquake and we are still in the process of aftershocks happening. And right now some of the projects, they are back, but with different regulations, which, for instance, ban using the word gender, or ban the conversation about LGBT community and equality. And our answer to this was that maybe we need to say no to some funding, even localized, if this funding goes against do no harm principles and our values. What here add? The localization became a big thing in Ukraine probably 3 years ago. For me, it was a little bit weird, because localization looked like very natural thing. And when we started having some working groups of international organizations talking to localization without local organization, our colleagues and both foreign colleagues and local colleagues, they were like, just give money to local NGOs. They have capacity. They already has been working and delivering projects and having due diligence. What's the problem? Why we need those frameworks, roundtables, meetings? But yeah, probably need those because yes, right now we have a strategy on localization. I think that in many cases, unfortunately, it's still on the paper. We still see the projects which have local partners only for the sake to ticking the box of having local partners, like 10% to local partner. Sometimes we are asked to violate the labor code in Ukraine because we're not allowed to hire people according to Ukrainian legislation, to save money, to give them more to the international partners. And things like this is still not quite inclusive in terms of strategy making. And even in spite that Ukrainian civil society showed that it could be better mobilized, that, for instance, UN coordination structures or OCHA, which was not very active or not active at all at the beginning of full-scale invasion, we still not trusted because we don't have diplomas from Geneva or from some other places. We have no experience of working at top level of UN agencies, and we still don't know all those magical words and the terms to use in the discussion to bring it to certain level of OCHA and other coordination mechanism. What do we need here? Yes, we need capacity building for local civil society organizations. We need access to education, to the jobs at those structures which make decisions. We need our voices not only for the sake of voices, but for the sake of discussion, which will be accessible for different people. Because I speak English, and yes, many people in Ukraine, they don't speak English, and they deserve to be involved in discussions of humanitarian response and needs plan and things like this. And yes, there are attempts to do this, but sometimes even when you at some meetings you can't contribute just because you don't know all the context of discussion, because it's like very special one. And yeah, mental health programs, that's also what we need, because all the work which is done in Ukraine by local partners, it's done with the cost of depressions and mental breakdowns and other consequences of stress and everyday shellings and tragedies. Why do we need this? Because we have no other choice. So regardless of everything, we will keep doing this as long as we're alive. Thank you for this opportunity.
Olga, thank you very much for sharing your experience. I do actually remember when the transition that support and stabilization services had at the beginning of the Russian invasion. I remember I had actually left my home that morning when the Russians invaded, and then we were able to connect, I think, the very next day. And Triple S was actually in Lviv, and they were one of the first organizations that started providing hot meals, completely shifting their strategy from a development project, working with the councils, to starting to deliver humanitarian response and helping all the waves of IDPs that they were actually coming into, people that were being displaced because of the Russian incursion into the country. You also highlighted some really interesting elements. For example, the element of instability, that sometimes funding actually can, when funding is present, it can be a good thing, but when funding is withdrawn, if it's not done in a responsible way, it can actually create harm. And that's a harm that has to be recognized as part of the overall localization agenda that it is present here. The second thing that you highlighted, which is really, really interesting, is the element of inclusiveness, that element of inclusion, where sometimes these discussions driven in terms of the localization agenda actually don't include the actors that are that should be actually present and should be leading these discussions, which are basically the organizations that are on the ground. That was one of the reasons why I definitely decided to not to do myself the conversation, but to open the floor to all of you, to give you an opportunity to share those experiences. And with that, I'm gonna ask Craig to share also the experience of Camino as a local or as well as a localization initiative. Craig is actually in Kiev. Both Craig and Anna are in Kiev. They actually, today was a difficult night. I don't know if you read on the news that the Russians actually sent one of the largest attacks in terms of missile attacks against the city of Kiev. So yeah, with that, I leave it for Craig. Craig, the floor is yours.
Hector and Catherine, thank you very much for pulling this all together. And it's great to be amongst a group of people with so much knowledge. And David, a lot of what you said resonates well, and Olga as well. So I entered Ukraine in February of 22 when this current invasion began. And that was waving the flag of water mission. So I established the water mission program here in Ukraine. But after 3 years of operating, water mission said to me, Craig, it's time for water mission to leave. Give us an exit strategy. And with that, we didn't have any partnerships in place that we could hand over the programming to. We had 100,000 people getting safe water from us every day on the front line. We were covering more than 500 kilometers of frontline daily with safe water. So we couldn't just dump the program. So the most responsible thing we could do was to establish Camino. Again, not a very Ukrainian name, as Olga was referring to her own, but it's the name that the Ukrainian team chose. And so we established this. It's myself and two Ukrainian ladies, our chief of finance and our chief programs officer. Established Camino in September last year. It was registered, and then with Water Mission, the phase-out plan meant that Camino started operating independently as of the 1st of February this year. And we have been blessed with good donors, but we're meeting roadblocks every step of the way. And I think the best description of our program is that we failed forwards. The roadblocks we were hitting is that if we wanted to get proper funding, and whilst this was a Water Mission program before we rebranded everything to Camino, we had funding with donors in excess of $1 million. We were well funded and we were moving hard and we were moving fast. But when it came to being localized, and that was the exit strategy for Water Mission, was this localization strategy to Camino with a handover. So for a year, we put in place with Camino local staff, 100% local procurement. All big decision-making went down to Ukrainians. So I would step aside and say, guys, if you're going that way or you're going that way, this is a Ukrainian decision that's going to impact Ukrainian people. And they would choose which way they wanted to go. So this has been very much a Ukrainian-driven program, although myself as an international has been the one leading it. But when it came to getting funding as Camino, when we took off the Water Mission hat, it was very interesting because all of the donors we had been working with couldn't work with us because we didn't have 2 years of financial track records. We didn't have financial records to show that go back 2 years of audited tracks. And what we realized is that this whole concept of localization is very much at the front of the program strategy, but the backside of it on the operations side and the finance side and the admin side, their risk avoidance policies do not actually permit for localization. And what happens is you get a lot of international NGOs registering as a local NGO, and then the donors just dump the money that way. Because coming back to what Olga said just now, international funding requires international knowledge to be able to land it. It's a whole vocabulary all on its own just to write those grants. And localization means that that funding should be going to local entities. But at the same time, there's a dichotomy in this, is that the local entities cannot comply with the international standards for international money. And this becomes one of the challenges. Now, for Camino, we're very fortunate in that we had a long relationship with these donors, and working with them, reminding them of their whole commitment within the grand bargain. We were able to have them take the fight to their upper echelons to be able to say, we need to work with these people. So we've been very successful, very fortunate, very blessed, however we want to look at this, in the way how we've managed to, I wouldn't say circumvent, but manage these hurdles that were put in front of us. So now Camino is running strong. We've got good grants in place. And our biggest challenge right now as we grow comes back down to unrestricted funding. We've got a reputation in Ukraine for running a good program. The donors respect the work we do. We're compliant on every aspect. We ran independent external audits voluntarily on ourselves. But our biggest challenge now is not programming funding, but it's unrestricted funding. This year, we've gone from 12 people to 32 people. And right now, I've got 3 people we can't buy a table and chair for, because there is no unrestricted funding to be able to make these little maneuvers. We've got vehicles that are fading out on the front line and shouldn't be anywhere near the front line for the safety of people. But unrestricted funding doesn't permit. So it's one thing to be able to say a local organization can pick up big grants, but a big grant requires backup support of unrestricted funding. So if you apply a basic UN ruling or UN thinking for a grant of $1 million, an NGO should be putting in around 15 to 20%. So $150,000, $200,000. And that's of their own raised funds. But how does a brand new organization in a country that's at war find $200,000 of unrestricted funding? And in this becomes one of the biggest challenges of it. But we have crossed many hurdles. As I said, we failed forwards, definitely. We've learned a lot along the way. And yes, from where we were 7 months ago, this is hugely successful. But when we look 7 months ahead, wow, we've got a lot of work to do to be able to remain compliant and be able to still achieve the vision we've got for the programming that needs to happen in Ukraine. So there is a challenge in this. There's a dichotomy in it that how one struggles to support the other. And I think the other point I'll make before I close is that localization seems to mean different things depending on who you talk to. So you'll get international NGOs that will run a localization agenda. And their localization agenda is they're going to pay locals to do everything, and we're going to teach you the international way. So I've got staff who sit in training programs endlessly. 2 months later, haven't yet done any programming, but the grant is open. And not to criticize in any way, it's just another way of looking how we address this. But there definitely is a gap in consistent thinking, and this comes back to something that you said earlier, is there's a gap in consistent thinking as to what does localization actually mean. And I think driving that forward would be very good to get I wouldn't say a standardized definition, but a bit more perspective, unpack it a bit more of what it could mean. And then local organizations can pick on those pieces to be able to identify where they fit in. I think I'll leave it at that and see if anyone has any questions later.
Greg, thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. It was really interesting what you mentioned in terms of the challenges, looking at it from the point of view of, on one hand, how access to unrestricted funding enabled that localization agenda, but on the other hand, also having these very, very, very deep and strict restrictions coming from the donors. Now, there's actually one of the reasons why it's really interesting that Anna is going to continue as a speaker is because Anna is actually working on specifically removing some of those barriers and actually doing advocacy with donors for addressing some of those operational challenges that many local NGOs are actually facing. So Anna, I leave the floor to you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Anna Nishnyanidze. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ukrainian locally led NGO Philanthropy in Ukraine. Today, through Philanthropy in Ukraine, my team and I are developing tools that help local organizations become more visible, more credible, and better connected to international partners. Philanthropy in Ukraine is an NGO that works to modernize the philanthropic ecosystem in Ukraine. Alongside our main platform, I will talk more about this platform a little bit later. We also run a wide range of initiatives designed to strengthen the nonprofit sector in Ukraine. From educational programs, guide, checklists, policies guide, webinars, to articles and in-depth researches. Also, we have built a professional network for people working in the nonprofit sector. And we do everything we can to provide organizations with knowledge and resources that help them grow. and about our platform. I have already teasered it. So this due diligence web platform is the heart of our work. It is an innovative tool that verifies Ukrainian NGOs and publishes open data about those who meet high standards of transparency and accountability. In other words, it makes trustworthy Ukrainian organizations more visible to the international and not only international community. It is like a bridge between Ukrainian organizations and others, international or other stakeholders who would like to support Ukrainian locally led organizations. In this way, philanthropy in Ukraine is not just about verification, it is an ecosystem level solution for the Ukrainian nonprofit sector. We help organizations become visible and trustworthy, but we also give them opportunities to grow, to learn, and to make their work more effective. But about localization, advancing localization in Ukraine is not easy. Local NGOs face many barriers. Endless duplication of due diligence processes, which drains time and energy. A lack of presence at high-level tables where funding and policy are decided. Also limited resources that force many to focus on survival rather than long-term strategies or localization questions. Our research confirms this. The will for localization inside sector exists, but the capacity to engage in it often missing. That is why we work both broadly, advocating for localization as a whole, and more specifically with what is now often called as one of the best practices of localization, the harmonization of due diligence processes. And it is exactly this case, this practical development of our organization that I would like to share with you today. This is where our platform steps in. It works for two sides at once. For Ukrainian NGOs, it's a chance to go through due diligence, receive an expert feedback, and be mapped in an open catalog. You can go on the website philanthropyinukraine.org and push bottom catalog and see verified organizations. It's both a visibility tool and a kind of like a journey map that shows where they are and what capacity strengthening steps lie ahead. For donors, grant makers, and philanthropists, it's a way to explore a wide range of locally led organizations, filter by their priorities, and choose partners they trust. And at the same time, the platform is a major step toward harmonizing and simplifying due diligence. Instead of every donor repeating the same checks, we propose a shared standard. When donors recognize and accept our methodology, local NGOs no longer need to go through a new due diligence process every single time. That means less burden for both sides, lighter for organizations, and also more efficient for grant makers and donors and philanthropists. But our work goes beyond the platform. We also do a lot of awareness raising about localization itself, like articles, events. We create space to explain in simple words what localization really means and why it matters for local Ukrainian NGOs. Our message to local organizations is clear. Localization is not only a benefit, localization also is responsibility. It's not something you wait to be handed. You need to be ready, capable, and willing to take it on. Of course, we face a lot of different challenges. The biggest one, if we are talking about cooperation with donors and grant makers, the biggest challenge is trust, or the lack of it toward local innovators. Too often, when innovation comes from Ukrainian stakeholder, from Ukrainian side, it is seen as risky, while the same idea from an NGO can be accepted. Donors wait until someone else endorses it, and only then they are willing to follow. That means we have to fight for every bit of trust. But it's not impossible. We already have successes. Our methodology, our platform was used in a large grant competition funded by German Humanitarian Localization Facility. Also, we are finalizing memorandums of mutual recognition of due diligences with 2 major NGOs. And now we are in dialogue phase with 2 large donors about integrating our platform into their practices. Unfortunately, I can't name them all yet, but if you are interested in, you can subscribe our communication channels, and soon you'll see the announcements. So yes, it's hard. Building trust in local innovations take persistence, but the progress is real, and I'm quite optimistic. Every step forward proves that cooperation is possible, and not only possible, but essential. And in closing, I want to say this. Localization, even though it has been discussed for years, is still brand new for Ukraine in Ukrainian context. Localization came to Ukraine when the full-scale invasion started. It is not yet fully implemented, not in the way we would like it to be. And innovation, anything truly new, always carries risk. And it is uncharted territory. It is like walking into a dark room. We don't fear the darkness itself. We fear not knowing what it hides. The same goes for adopting innovation. And in this case, for adopting localization. Until we take that step, until we accept the risk and the responsibility, until we switch on the light, we won't know if it will work or not, if it will be good or not. But if we want to measure real progress, if we want true success in localization, we must be brave enough to take that risk and to turn on the light.
Anna, that was very, very interesting. What the point that you brought about the innovation and how innovation, when it's seen as coming from a local NGO, is seen as a risk. While when it's coming from an international NGO, it's actually seen as an opportunity. And that actually touches a little bit on the power structures that Brian actually make a reference at the beginning of the conversation. Now, that's interestingly, like David has worked in creating an enabling environment for small citizen activities that they have actually put forward some innovative solutions for the response as with different type of different modality of funding that is external from donors. So David, I let the floor for you.
Hector, thank you for having me. I can just follow my pre-speakers, and say that it's a pleasure to be here. I have been nodding a lot in those last couple of minutes because all the points actually that have been raised have been hitting in a spot that we have been observing ourselves as well. I'm head of operations at WeAid. WeAid is a nonprofit in Berlin. I'm just going to quickly tell you who we are, what we do, and how we're doing it. WeAid itself was founded in 2022 as a direct response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What we do is basically we provide our nonprofit infrastructure for everybody in Germany that wants to contribute with their activities to the public well-being. So that's for everything that serves nonprofit purposes. But first and foremost, we still support citizen-led initiatives in crisis and recovery contexts, and especially in help of Ukraine, because that is our origin story and the need is still there. Because when the war started, people were trying to help, right? People in Germany were just private people were just coming together, trying to help to find food for displaced people that were coming to Germany, clothing, shelter, basic necessities. And in that way, many local initiatives formed pretty quickly to provide that aid. So we had to, because this form of engagement is happening, but it was kind of like under the radar. So we had to found the organization to give local initiatives a legal, financial, and compliance infrastructure, which they need to operate professionally without having to fund an NGO themselves. So yeah, like Hector said, we create this environment of stability, professionalism, and personal empowerment by taking care of bureaucracy, right? This may be no news for the audience because we are in San Diego at the moment, but the way we are supporting these initiatives is through fiscal hosting. That is a concept that is very known in Anglo-Saxon countries, I would say. In Europe, the model is still pretty much underdeveloped. We consider it essential if we want to shift power to local actors. We think it's a game changer for localization, generally for enabling or just empowering civic society, because it allows informal groups to receive and manage funds legally and transparently. So we are kind of pioneering this approach, offering professional backbone to just establish a situation with donor confidence while still letting those grassroots initiatives stay agile and community rooted. So yeah, as in, like many of you know, disaster response, it's about trust, speed, and impact without bureaucracy getting in the way. So we ourselves, we don't necessarily implement aid, we enable those who do. That's the theory. Practice is another thing in reality. As mentioned before, the first responders in Ukraine, for example, weren't necessarily organizations. They were neighbors, friends, family. We have been witnessing since the start of the Russian invasion an incredible mobilization of citizens in Germany and Ukraine. I think Hector might have alluded to that earlier with some sugarcoating, if I heard that right. There's one example I want to share is one of our initiatives. It's called Bake for Ukraine. Bake for Ukraine is a group of people, of women, 3 women that have been displaced at the start of the war, or already have been living in Germany, that well, wanted to react to food shortages. And they did that at first by buying flour in Germany or the European Union, and then shipping that to Ukraine, which turned out to be very expensive. So they went to Ukraine and started buying flour there and give that to bakeries. And they needed a crowdfunding tool in Germany. So this is where we came together and, well, took care of all the administration that comes with that. But then they developed activities as well in Ukraine itself. So they started to buy old truck carriages, so to speak, to set up mobile bakeries that can reach the far off villages, so to speak, that are oftentimes left out by aid deliveries. And this is still going with an incredible impact and with incredible dedication, where we as a fiscal host can provide this infrastructure, this environment. Another pretty fitting example would be the Berlin-Odessa Express, a group of Berliners that had friends in Odessa that when the war broke out needed to bring humanitarian aid to the people, and they did that renting trucks themselves with speed, like, and of course knowing the locals, having the connections, knowing the needs. And they did that pretty efficiently, but they didn't have the infrastructure. So they couldn't accept donations as formal donations. They would accumulate that on their private wealth, so to speak, which results in more tax debt. They would have trouble getting those informal donations in kind into the country because those have to be declared. So this is where we could help as well. This is where we just like the need for nonprofit infrastructure is there when we are talking about cross-border giving within borders as well. But this is something where we sort of, I would say, formalize the informal, and that always needs to be delivered to a formal address still at the moment. We're dreaming of a different future. For example, through fiscal host networks that could be set up in the respective countries. Because in the end, we need the nonprofit organization somewhat, but we could empower the localization agenda by just giving this roof to people. Regulations are different in every country. I think I don't need to tell you that, which is also, and you just said harmonization of due diligence processes. That is something we have a keen interest in as well, because that is something that, will accompany us for a longer time. These stories, they just didn't happen. They needed funding as well, right? So we tried our luck in crowdfunding, in nonprofit crowdfunding, which is a novelty, I would say, in Germany at least. So we're trying to enable direct funding to those grassroots actors through a couple of means, bank transfers, credit card, PayPal, Stripe, and the like. We are working on ways to enable crypto donations. We're working together with Start Next, which is one of the biggest crowdfunding portal in Germany, and sort of trying to push the agenda here, basically what we're trying to achieve is building the infrastructure for localization, locals helping locals. So a crowdfunding-led citizens support citizens. If we can frame it non-profit, then this is perfect. And that, sometimes feels like humanitarian aid without the middleman that we're trying to achieve here. Of course, we also have challenges. The work isn't easy. I would say one major point is, of course, the money. There is no core funding for fiscal hosts like us in the EU. And I can only second that when in doubt, donors will mostly favor large NGOs because they are established and the trust is there. So nobody really wants to take the first step if there is not already a history of success, so to speak. And one major challenge is just grassroots initiatives are not always from the third sector, so to speak. They're not non-profit professionals, so to speak. So they if there's no formal organization in the back, or if they don't work, if they don't come from a formal organizations, they struggle with things like compliance, banking, visibility. Everything you need as an NGO, where you would have in bigger organizations the apparatus that we are trying to give them. So we see that we have enormous capacities in civic society of private people that want to get active. We can empower them, but we also need to educate them, right? On how to do that, because those actors are they are the actors that are changing, that are driving the change on the ground. So give me. Am I through? Is my time through?
Yep.
I haven't been checking. All right. Let me give a good catchphrase in the end. We have the proof that citizens can lead if we give them the tools. Communities usually have a good understanding of what they need, and they can organize themselves fairly well, local and across borders. So we want to make nonprofit crowdfunding and fiscal hosting a standard in Europe and not the exception. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, David. That was actually really, really insightful, and I really like how the closing line that you mentioned. Like, citizens know exactly what they need, and they can deliver it in the most efficient way. I do remember that back in the at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. I remember Olga being one of the responders, and I do remember many citizens moving forward to respond to the crisis. Now we are at time. But if you can just stay with me for 5 additional minutes to ask you one question to all the panelists, and it is basically, what opportunities do you see to drive the localization agenda, and what message would you like to give the audience that is present in order for them to be able to support the localization agenda in Ukraine? Who would like to start?
I would say, obviously, I'm going to say expand fiscal hosting and the networks of fiscal hosting. But people can do 2 things on the donor side. Just trust the initiatives that are there. If there is a established framework, an established compliancy framework within an organization, then the community initiatives will do good work, so to speak. But on the same time, you can always get active yourself, right? Like build local ecosystems, connect grassroots initiatives, and just wherever you wherever you see yourself fitting in, provide with the skills you have. That is something we are trying to achieve, to get everybody to lose the fear of aiding, so to speak.
I think that this conversation brought a lot of great ideas and good practices. And speaking about opportunities, I tend to think about humanitarian reset as an opportunity for local actors. And I would like to see it being used in Ukraine properly. And of course, as a founder of Network of IDP Councils, I would ask you to talk to IDP Councils if you plan some programming which targets internally displaced persons. So just like this. Thank you.
I have 2 very concrete ideas, 2 very concrete directions. The first is collaboration with our platform and using it, supporting organization, not our organization, directly verified, trustworthy organizations, support them directly. And second idea is investment in pooled funds. This wasn't the main topic of today's discussion, but it is also one of the best practices in localization. And I know that in Ukraine now there are like different pooled funds are in process of development. And as philanthropy in Ukraine, we are part of the consortium behind the Ukrainian-led pooled fund. And I think that it is also like good idea.
There's a lot of very good examples of success factors in this. Just this panel alone, there's huge success factors that can be replicated. But I think my big message would go to donors. Know the program, know the people running the program. Okay, donors move slowly because they have all of these old policies and procedures in place, which is fine. They need it because they're spending someone else's money. Total transparency. The whole industry has been set up like that. But if we take a space like Ukraine, where the front line is unpredictable, the needs change from one day to the next, these local partners know how to adapt quicker than an international donor can adapt their policies to suit it. So get to know your partners and then work together to be able to mitigate those risks. All the donors' apprehensions to working with local partners is risk mitigation against financial procedures. Work with them and build it up. It's easy enough to do, but the donor has to want to do it. Instead of just turning to the international organization because it's easier and they've got a grant manager with 15 years experience in ECHO funding or USAID funding. Okay, don't just go where it's easier, go where it's needed. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Hector.
I didn't want to build up on on what Craig just said. I completely agree, but I'll start off by saying I think the biggest contribution we could have is not viewing this discussion as binary, as it's locals versus international agencies and NGOs. I think that we can all work together. There's value added through the creation of synergies and partnerships. It's really clarifying and defining those type of roles and responsibilities, though, vis-a-vis the importance of localization. That said, in terms of addressing a lot of the risks and compliance issues, because this is systematic, institutional donors are very risk aversive when it comes to local actors. They're happy to define something as a risk as opposed to innovation. I do think, though, again, going back on the example I raised about PEPFAR and USAID, is something super interesting, that the donor itself became operational. Why? Because they wanted to engage directly with the local actors to determine their needs, their gaps, and identify ways they can work with them, as opposed to doing it through an intermediary. And that kicked off because there was political will in the US Congress, in the government, to say, hey, USAID, you're the institutional donor. We want to increase efficiencies and effectiveness. So become operational. Get to know who those local actors are, form relations with them, build trust, and identify ways of working. And that's a huge opportunity, but it's a change in mindset. That would be a mindset that taxpayers need to push their governments to enforce, but also as an institutions themselves, they'll need to redefine how they work and what their role is within the broader system. But again, I'm optimistic. I don't see this as a binary conflictive issue. I think there's so much room to improve the situation and really push localization systematically.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I think this was a really lovely discussion. And we had such a great panel that really talked about the need for localization. I think that it really is the future of sustainable humanitarian aid. And I'm just so happy that we could host this discussion. It will be recorded and on the YouTube channel, and hopefully this really helps a lot of other people understand more about humanitarian aid and the need to really support the communities to advocate for themselves. So thank you, everybody.